briefly take a whirlwind tour around the topic of rotavirus vaccines development, implementation and impact. And in the completion of the talk, I'm going to talk about a new novel vaccine that we have under development in Melbourne. Diarrhoea, we've heard a couple of times this morning already, is a leading cause of disease in animals, it seems, and also in children. It's one of the key causes of child death in children less than 5 years of age. About 800,000 child deaths each year due to diarrhoea. And it's about a cause for about 10% of deaths in children worldwide under 5 years. The causes are a number, but in particular, rotavirus is the most common cause of diarrhoea in children less than 12 months of age. Rotavirus is called a democratic virus. Almost all children worldwide, whether you live in the outskirts of an African village or in Melbourne or in Brisbane, get an episode of rotavirus disease before they're 5 years of age. It's the most common cause of diarrhoea, as I've mentioned, in children worldwide, less than 11 months. And improvements in sanitation and drinking water do not adequately protect from rotavirus disease. In 2009, the WHO recommended that all children worldwide should receive a rotavirus vaccine. Rotavirus is particular among the causes of diarrhoea in children in that it causes a severe dehydrating gastroenteritis. And it's the dehydration that kills. And other strategies for treatment of rotavirus diarrhoea is rehydration, either with oral rehydration solutions or with intravenous fluid. And this is very effective, it's life-saving, and the children can recover well with no sequelae if they're treated for their dehydration. But the children in remote settings, unable to access health care and to receive rehydration, are the children that are at risk of death. And it might not be surprising that the majority of deaths occur in those most impoverished countries of the world. But it's not only deaths from diarrhoea that is of concern in terms of child health. There is a huge amount of hospitalisation associated with rotavirus diarrhoea. And children who have an episode of diarrhoea are 8.5 times more likely to die within 2 months of having a diarrheal disease, usually after they leave hospital. Children are more likely to be stunted after an episode of diarrhoea. So it has other consequences, even if you do recover from the episode of gastroenteritis, in terms of susceptibility to other infection and disease, and in terms of malnutrition and growth failure. Some of you may not be aware in the audience that rotavirus was actually discovered and identified in Melbourne back in the 1970s. So we see ourselves as a home of rotavirus down in Melbourne. By Ruth Bishop and her team at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne with the University of Melbourne colleagues who identified this picture in a child who presented acutely with a severe gastroenteritis on a duodenal sample. This was the first picture they put under the electron microscope, and they saw what people had not seen in babies with diarrhoea, these little round-like particles, subsequently named rotavirus. Ruth Bishop is still engaged and involved in our research team in Melbourne. We know a lot more about rotavirus now. It's a complex particle that has a number of different possibilities associated with receptors to attach to the bowel wall and induce immune responses. These are also posed targets for vaccine strategies. Interestingly, rotavirus disease strains vary across different regions of the world and vary from year to year within those regions. And so a vaccine would need to be able to deal with changing vaccine strains in time and in regions. There are 2 internationally licensed rotavirus vaccines currently. One is a product called Rotavirus from Merck and the other Rotavirus from GSK, and these have been developed using different vaccine strategies. The Rotavirus vaccine from Merck is developed with 5 bovine rotavirus strains with 1 human strain, and so it's a pentavalent vaccine, a recombinant vaccine. In contrast, the Rotavirus strain from GSK is a single human rotavirus strain identified and attenuated in the lab from a child who had severe rotavirus disease. So quite different vaccine strategies. The pre-licenses trials of both of these vaccines showed very similar results in terms of the protection offered against severe rotavirus disease. What was clear also, and we'll come back to this theme throughout my brief presentation, is the protection offered by these vaccines in developed countries was much stronger than that protection offered in developing countries. And here's just a fairly brief summary in the global regions of the type of protection. In US, Finland, and Australia is around 98% for both vaccines. In India, this is the Indian rotavirus vaccine that has just been licensed in India but not available internationally, a little less protective. The vaccine, the Rotavirus from Merck, a little less protective in Southeast Asia, and emerging results now coming from the African region, also showing reasonable protection, but certainly not the same as we would see in Australia. These are oral vaccines in a dose of about 1.5 mils, slightly different between the 2 different preparations. And as I mentioned, the Rotavirus reassortant vaccine is targeting 5 different rotavirus strains, the most common strains that occur worldwide. On the other hand, the Rotavirus, the human monovalent strain, is one strain which appears to have heterotypic protection across a range of rotavirus vaccines. As mentioned, because of the pre-licensure trials showing good promise for protection against severe rotavirus disease, a recommendation was made in 2009 for children around the world all to receive a rotavirus vaccine, as all children around the world are susceptible to this severe infection. To date, as of June this year, 77 countries have introduced rotavirus vaccines into their national immunisation programs. Australia was an early introducer back in 2009. Some of these with the help of the Gavi Alliance and funding externally to reduce the cost to countries for introduction. However, there are many countries, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, where rotavirus vaccines are not routinely available within national immunisation program to babies. The good news is that these rotavirus vaccines have had a great impact in the real-world context outside of the clinical trial, with a reduction in rotavirus hospitalisations of 50% or more in children 0 to 2 years following vaccination. In Australia, it's around 87%, even higher, of a reduction, and I'm a paediatric gastroenterologist. I work at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. We don't see rotavirus disease like we did when I was training 20 years ago. In addition, there has been a reduction in all-cause diarrhoea seen in many hospitals, and we can speculate why that might be so. There is emerging data coming from a number of countries who have introduced rotavirus vaccines over the last 5 years, of a reduction in deaths from all-cause gastroenteritis. This is some data from Mexico showing reduction in children less than 12 months of age or less than or equal to 11 months of age in all-cause diarrhoea deaths. Rotavirus vaccines are also seen to be cost-effective, and this is some data that has been established to produce a case for funding for countries considering introduction of rotavirus vaccines into their national immunisation program. However, is our work done? Have we cured rotavirus and we can just pat ourselves on the back and work away? And I'd probably say not yet. We've progressed a long way. We've got some good data. We've made some great effect, but we're not there yet. And this graph gives one reason why we might not be there yet. And this really looks at the one-year efficacy of the 2 internationally introduced rotavirus vaccines according to the GDP per head, showing that the vaccines really work very well in developed country settings, but only 50-50 really in countries where the disease burden is higher and in areas where most deaths occur. There are also other challenges to the implementation of rotavirus vaccines, and that it's very similar to the previous presentation around the burden on the cold chain. How do you reach children in very remote areas? Cost is still an issue, and cost for a course of rotavirus vaccine in Australia would be on the private market when they were first introduced was about $200 a course. In some countries it's still between $100 and $200, and for countries which are not eligible for Gavi costing support, this is still a major issue. There continue to be some concerns around safety. The first rotavirus vaccine that was introduced in the US had some concerns of a rare association with intussusception, a blockage of the bowel. This has been seen at a very small rate in the current commercially available vaccines. However, the benefits are considered to far outweigh the risks of this complication, and is accepted. And we certainly in Australia we see this is very much a favourable risk-benefit ratio. And there are issues about vaccine supply. If you consider all the children of the world need to be vaccinated, or the desire is that they should be vaccinated against rotavirus disease. As a result, there have been a number of companies that are developing rotavirus vaccines, many of them from emerging country manufacturers, with the aim to produce a low-cost vaccine. We've been working on a novel vaccine candidate I'll introduce in a moment, the aim as a low-cost vaccine to improve on the current licensed products in terms of performance. And our question, our research question was, is it possible to take advantage of the novel characteristics of a human neonatal rotavirus strain to protect babies against rotavirus disease from birth? The current vaccines, they're given as oral vaccine, 2 or 3 doses, depending on which vaccine you used, starting at the earliest at 6 weeks of age. And so there is a time where babies are not protected between 0 or 6 weeks of age, and there are issues around implementation and timeliness of implementation, which does impact on how complete immunisation children receive. So the question might be, how can we improve by giving a dose of a rotavirus vaccine earlier? And why consider, or should we consider, a birth dose? And we would argue yes, and based on 3 different premises. One is specific to characteristics of rotavirus disease, one is specific to rotavirus vaccines, and the other is around enhancing coverage and impact of the vaccination implementation. In terms of the first point here, specific to rotavirus disease, rotavirus, we all get rotavirus probably more than once a year. We don't know we have it because we have an active immune response which prevents us from getting disease from that infection. The first infection a baby gets is usually the most severe, and it's the one that usually causes death and severe dehydration. After that first infection, there is an immune response which decreases the impact of disease and symptoms on subsequent exposure to disease. And a baby might be exposed, particularly in countries like India, 4 times in the first year of life. The most severe episode is usually the first, then next the second, third and fourth. And usually by that time they've built up quite a robust immune system. So a vaccine strategy is not to prevent infection, it's to prevent disease from infection and to provide protection against that disease from the first rotavirus infection. In developing countries, babies are exposed at an earlier age. There's a gap of protection between a birth and when the first dose is delivered. And there are some specific novel rotavirus strains that occur naturally in babies in the first month of life, where babies are infected but don't cause disease. In terms of some of the advantages of a birth dose of a rotavirus disease are also specific to the actual vaccine itself. This is an oral vaccine, it has to pass through the stomach. At birth, the babies have either an alkaline or neutral gastric acid environment, so acid is usually not a challenge to vaccine. The intestinal microbiota is not yet established in a newborn baby. The potential for impact from maternal milk antibodies, which is thought to be a challenge for oral vaccines, is usually not an issue at birth if the vaccine is given early enough. And there are safety reasons why a birth dose might be advantageous. Sorry, my numbering's gone odd here. The other important reason why a birth dose might be helpful is that in many countries, birth is an ideal opportunity to provide an immunisation. Mothers and babies are more likely to be associated with a healthcare worker at this time. It's a time to increase the uptake of other vaccines and to complete the 3 doses of vaccine if that's what's required at an earlier age, if the first dose is given very early. We would argue if you were going to give a birth dose of a rotavirus vaccine, then we should perhaps use the lessons from nature and use a neonatal human strain. Neonatal rotavirus strains do infect babies in the first month of life normally, but don't cause disease. They have specific receptors and specific ways they attach into the newborn gut. And some of these differences are related to the structural proteins of the neonatal strains, differences in integrin recognition, and it's not the same for all neonatal rotavirus strains. In Melbourne, we've been developing a novel vaccine called RV3, which is an oral vaccine based on a human neonatal strain to be delivered at birth. And this is Ruth Bishop in an older age from the time she first discovered rotavirus, developing the RV3 vaccine. We've had a strong collaboration of a number of partners, including New Zealand and Indonesia. We're currently working with an emerging market vaccine manufacturer around focusing on a low-cost vaccine in association with a number of strategic partnerships. We've conducted a phase 1 safety trial in Melbourne, showed that the vaccine was well tolerated in adults, children and infants. We've conducted a phase 2 study, 2A study, safety and immunogenicity study in New Zealand. This was the first time newborn babies were given the vaccine, as well as babies at the current routine schedule at 6 to 8 weeks. And this trial completed last year, and what we found in immune response was very good, and over 90% of babies responded after 3 doses in either a birth dose schedule, starting with a first dose at birth, then at 8 weeks and then 14 weeks, or given at the traditional infant schedule like the other current commercial vaccines. So it appears that there is a robust immune response. We're currently in 2B in Indonesia, in villages in the central Java region, with the recruitment completed in that study now. This study has involved about 400 village midwives across the central Java region, and in collaboration with the University of Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta. However, there's still work to be done, and that's why it's terrific to have your expertise in the room. There's still lots of questions around how to improve implementation of rotavirus vaccines, things that we've been talking about this morning around cold chain, minimising the volume required, how to present these vaccines in a very environmentally friendly way, and how to be able to deliver them in a way that's better than what's being done now. And they're the new generation challenges. It's fine to have a vaccine, but at the moment, and we have a very good vaccine, but we certainly can use some of the knowledge and advancements to make our second and third generation rotavirus vaccines easier to implement in developing countries in particular, hopefully to address some cost issues around programmatic issues, which are important barriers to reaching those places in the world who have still not introduced rotavirus vaccines. And we've only got about 39%, a great achievement to get about 39% of countries that have a rotavirus vaccine in a national immunisation program, but there's still babies out there who would benefit significantly from having a vaccine, and still deaths occurring, around 250,000 babies each year dying from rotavirus disease that could be prevented if we could improve on the vaccines and implement them better. I'd like to challenge you with some of those things and invite you to the International Rotavirus Symposium occurring next year in September, where hopefully we'll bring lots of new ideas on how to improve rotavirus vaccines.
Thank you very much for this clarifying talk on a terrible disease. And are there any questions? I might ask one myself. This difference between the low GDP countries and the other countries, is it due to other strains that are not covered, or is it due to another virus?
It's not due to another virus. These are rotavirus disease and confirmed rotavirus disease. It's unlikely to be due to other strains, although strains do change from time to time. The main challenge is thought to be due to the challenge to the vaccine itself, in terms of the vaccine has to transit from through the gut, the stomach. It has the gut is quite a complex place. It has to actually be absorbed or not absorbed, but find receptors and produce an immune response and compete with a lot of antigens coming from breast milk, coming from environmental antigens as well. So it's not thought to be necessary. That being said, in Africa there is a certain group of strains which might not be quite as covered as the strains are in the US.
Thank you.
Yes. So the neonatal strains of rotavirus, so they cross-react with the more virulent ones?
Correct. Yes.
And you mentioned that the maternal antibodies got problem neonate or neonate. I would have thought it would be more of an issue for neonate.
So, not particularly, but what happens is that rotavirus is a mucosal infection, and so it's on the mucosa where you need to generate that immune response. Maternal antibodies, which the baby gets, and will have levels of maternal antibody and are serological antibodies, and it's not thought, and when we've looked at, we actually have done a number of studies, others and ourselves, looking at maternal antibodies and IgG response. It's the IgA response in particular that is important for, although we don't have a good correlative protection, one of the challenges for vaccine development in rotavirus, but IgA is a much stronger correlative protection. So it does. That being said, if you look at maternal antibodies and breast milk antibodies in mothers and baby pairs in developing countries, they are very high. Despite that, these babies do get rotavirus disease and die in large numbers in these countries. So although they're high levels, they're doing part of the job, but we're still seeing a lot of mortality and morbidity despite that. That's probably a better answer.
Yes.
So is one of the problems that because you're giving live virus each time, that you're actually neutralising the subsequent doses? And so would it work better with a live virus initially to prime, but then an inactivated virus as a boost? Because then you can't neutralise.
Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily... The way the vaccine works is that it sets up active replication. So the virus infects and then it sets up active replication and subsequently... And so it's actually good to be continually exposed because that will continue to enhance. But your comment about having a priming and a boosting dose strategy is one that is being looked at the moment. There's some inactivated products currently being developed on the market, but that will be for a later, probably later administration dose. So it could fit into a prime boost strategy. For the current, the one that we're talking about, we've not finished formulating this, but we're targeting a similar to that, 4 to 8. I mean, it'd be lovely to have, and that would be the second and third generation. We'd love to beat the cold chain. But currently in the cold chain, rotavirus vaccines take up something like about 5 times more than all other EPI vaccines. They're very large and bulky, and that's a real programmatic challenge.
How long do you think Australians colonise the government?
So the maximum peak replication period is between 2 and 7 days following vaccination, and then there is a fall off, and probably is all done and dusted by about 2 weeks or so. But in some babies might be longer unless you've got an immune deficiency, in which case it'll continue to replicate.
Other question?
So is your plan like to start the baby with the neonatal, the neonatal dose to be followed by the infant dose? Is this more like the boosting effect that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'd love it that the neonatal dose would be all that we would need. We don't have that data, and no one's it would be a lovely study to do, but it's a hard study to do. At the moment, we are doing our clinical trial with 3 doses, the first one at birth, the next one at 6 weeks, and the next one at 12 weeks, or around that, fitting in whatever the EPI schedule is with that country. So the same vaccine as 3 doses. Whether we need 3 doses, whether we can have 2 doses, or whether we can have 1 dose. Interestingly, as given as an infant doses, 2 seems to be adequate to produce an immune response. So if that is reflective of protection, it may be that 2 doses is sufficient. But we're still on relatively early stage development at the moment in terms of clinical trial development.
Okay, so last question.
Production cost is very important about the rotavirus vaccine. How do you expect it about RV3 strain rotavirus vaccine? Production cost. Sorry? How do you expect about production cost of
Production cost?
Yeah.
Well, the current, it's impossible really for me to answer that question. We're in the process of large-scale process development, so I can't give you an accurate cost. Knowing that is that the target is somewhere around $1 a dose. But whether we can achieve that or not,